Mrs. Mitchell shut the door to the classroom and approached the pupil. Rachel once again did not do her homework, and now she was looking at the teacher defiantly, ready to be reprimanded. It was not the first case of the girl's careless attitude towards her studies, and all the teachers were dissatisfied with it. Mrs. Mitchell silently looked at the student, hesitating to start a conversation. "I'll get better, I promise. I was at swimming practice, you know that. That's why I didn't have time for homework." The schoolgirl was the first to start the conversation. Mrs. Mitchell could have argued, but remained silent. She had already learned from Rachel's coach that she had also abandoned her training. But currently Mrs. Mitchell was going to talk about something entirely different. "You see, Rachel, I have a daughter. She's about your age, and she has some problems." The woman spoke quietly, and Rachel was greatly surprised at this revelation. Mrs. Mitchell took a breath and then spoke quickly, as if she was afraid of being interrupted by her revelation. She told the girl that her 13-year-old daughter Holly, disabled since birth, studied remotely and had no friends at all. Of course, the girl communicates on the internet, but virtual friends cannot replace her real ones. And then Mrs. Mitchell said something that greatly puzzled Rachel. The woman asked the student to become a friend for her daughter, at least for one evening. For this service, Mrs. Mitchell was willing to pay, and on top of that, correct a few of Rachel's grades. The girl was at a loss, and did not immediately understand what to do. If the request had come from any other teacher, she certainly would not have agreed, and even made fun of the teacher along with her friends. But Mrs. Mitchell was her class teacher, whom all the students treated with great respect. Besides, the idea of correcting grades seemed tempting to Rachel. "I think I can do it," she answered cautiously. "Thank you, but I'll warn you right away, my daughter has a difficult temper," said Mrs. Mitchell. It was indeed so. Confined to a wheelchair since childhood, Holly also had an unattractive appearance and was terribly worried about it. At an early age, she was often hurt by children because she didn't look like them. So Holly withdrew into herself and became embittered, trying not to communicate with anybody. Then Mrs. Mitchell decided to transfer the girl to distance learning, and now in desperation decided to pay for the friendship so that her daughter, at least for a while, felt less alone. Rachel listened carefully to the teacher and assured her that she was ready to stay with Holly. They immediately invented a legend according to which Rachel would come to visit the teacher to help her study. Then Mrs. Mitchell will urgently need to go away to an acquaintance who needs help. The woman will leave the girls alone and tell her she will be back soon, but she won't come back until a few hours later. The next day they did everything as planned. Rachel came, and Mrs. Mitchell invited her student to join them at the dinner table. While the three of them drank tea, Holly was silent and only threw unfriendly, prickly glances at the guest. Then Mrs. Mitchell, as agreed, left to see an urgent friend who had called, asking Rachel to wait. In fact, she visited her neighbour, a talkative, nice elderly woman, over the warm conversation with whom Mrs. Mitchell did not notice that too much time had passed. The woman rushed to her apartment, but was shocked by what she saw. The girls interrupted their merry, lively conversation and froze embarrassed. Mrs. Mitchell looked at her daughter and could not believe her eyes. She had not heard Holly laugh so much in a long time, but most of all, she was struck by how her daughter's appearance had changed. Always frowning, with an angry look on her face, Holly was now an entirely different person. The girl's hair was beautifully styled, curls gently framing her face, making it visually more pleasing, as well as expertly done makeup. Holly was simply glowing with happiness, and Mrs. Mitchell felt she was about to cry for joy herself. Mrs. Mitchell apologised for coming so late and, taking a box of chocolates out of her bag, offered tea again. They happily nodded, and Mrs. Mitchell, delighted by this change in her daughter's mood, ran into the kitchen. While she was setting the table, she listened to what was happening in the room, and her heart ached. She heard Holly telling Rachel about her favourite game and promising to help her new friend with computer science. Mrs. Mitchell immediately imagined how upset her daughter would be when she realised she had no friend. Mrs. Mitchell almost cried because once again she cannot ask Rachel for such a favour. But then she still found the strength not to think about bad things. I should live with what I have now, and now Holly is happy, she thought. Holly's special appearance and disability since childhood made her an outcast. The girl was smart and had no problems with her studies, but she spent all her spare time in the virtual world where no one saw her face or her wheelchair. Her mother sincerely believed that if her daughter had a friend in real life, her temper would change and the girl would open up from a new side. Sitting in the kitchen and watching the girls drinking tea, Mrs. Mitchell could not believe that her idea was a success and everything went so well. Only later, she learned from Holly that things were not so peaceful in the beginning. When Rachel was alone with Holly, she tried to talk to her, but the girl answered sharply and asked her to stay away from her. That's when Rachel made her very surprised, saying that she was envious of her. At first, Holly thought the guest was making fun of her, because it was hard to be jealous of a disabled person with an unpretty, ugly face. But Rachel explained to her that appearance was not the most important thing, because it could be changed with plastic surgery, but it was almost impossible to change a person's inner world. Rachel envied Holly because the girl was smart, good at school, and in addition, she had a wonderful mother who loved her and supported her in everything. Rachel didn't really want to talk about her family, but it became clear that the girl had big problems. Rachel convinced Holly that a disabled person, just like any other person, could find a good job, start a family and live a happy life. Unfortunately, she could not cure Holly, but she could help her change her appearance. Rachel's sister worked in a beauty salon as a hairdresser and often shared the secrets of her skills with her. Rachel was going to follow her sister's example in the future, so she suggested that Holly get her makeup and hairdo done, and both were happy with the result. Mrs. Mitchell was grateful to Rachel for giving her daughter hope and faith in herself. But the next day, she was really shocked when she saw Rachel again on their doorstep. "Rachel, I'm sorry," the teacher said confusedly, "but I have nothing to pay you today." "No, you don't have to," Rachel frowned. "I just came to see my friend." Rachel, as if nothing had happened, went into Holly's room, and Mrs. Mitchell remained standing, stunned, looking after her. As it turned out, the girls had agreed on everything yesterday, so, as the legend was that yesterday Rachel came to improve the knowledge of mathematics, then Holly, while the girl was doing her hair, explained to her a few topics. Then it turned out that Rachel had difficulties with other subjects, and Holly offered to help her. They decided to start with computer science, and Holly was able to explain everything easily. Since then, Rachel started to visit the teacher and her daughter all the time. Mrs. Mitchell didn't mind, and by communicating with Rachel frequently, she got to know her better over time, and she could understand a lot. As it turned out, Rachel was from a troubled family. Her parents drank heavily, and only her older sister, who managed to leave the parental home in time to find a good job, supported her sister as best she could. Because her parents ignored her, Rachel's character was complicated, and her antics at school were often just an attempt to draw attention to herself. Rachel was acting brazenly and boldly in the company of peers like her, feeling her importance, but there was no one to help her with her studies. Over time, she completely lost interest in education, as she was going to work as a hairdresser like her sister, and a lot of school knowledge was not necessary in that field. But after meeting Holly, Rachel got other interests and a desire to get some other, more serious profession. She had never really taken much interest in computer science. She didn't even have a computer at home. But when Holly showed her the different programs and explained how they worked, Rachel liked it. The girl often visited Holly and sometimes stayed overnight. Soon, Rachel and Holly decided that after graduation, they would study programming together in college and thus be able to support each other in difficult situations. So, one unusual request from the teacher became the beginning of a strong friendship between such different, but in some ways similar, girls. Each of them had a different reason for resentment and bitterness, but they helped each other to change.